A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. I am Corn, and today we are looking at a situation that has been unfolding right in our backyard, metaphorically speaking, but with massive implications for global trade, national security, and the very definition of diplomatic statecraft. It is a topic that our housemate Daniel brought to our attention this morning, and frankly, it is something we have been tracking closely for the last year. We are standing here on March 13th, 2026, and looking back at a year of unprecedented diplomatic silence.
Herman Poppleberry here, and you are right, Corn. We are talking about the complete breakdown in diplomatic relations between Ireland and Israel. It has been over a year since the Israeli embassy in Dublin officially closed its doors in January 2025, and since then the silence has been deafening. But it is not just about empty buildings on Pembroke Road or recalled ambassadors. We are seeing a sovereign nation, Ireland, essentially trying to legislate itself out of the global supply chain in the name of a very specific, and some would say myopic, moral crusade. It is a paradox, really. A nation that built its entire modern identity on being the most open, globalized economy in the world is now building a legislative wall around itself.
It is a fascinating study in contrast, is it not? On one hand, you have Ireland, a country that has built its staggering economic success on being the friendly, neutral gateway for American capital into Europe. On the other hand, you have this increasingly aggressive, almost performative isolationism when it comes to Israel, specifically the passage of the Israeli settlement's prohibition of importation of goods Bill of 2025. This was not just a minor tweak to trade policy. It was a fundamental shift in how Ireland interacts with the world, and today we are going to peel back the layers of why this happened and what it actually costs.
And let us be clear about the stakes here. This is not just a white paper or a non-binding resolution passed by a local council. This is a piece of legislation that effectively criminalizes trade with specific regions, and in doing so, it has set off a chain reaction that is threatening to sever Ireland's most vital lifeline, its relationship with the United States. When you look at the rhetoric coming out of the Oireachtas, that is the Irish Parliament, you hear a lot about being on the right side of history. But when you look at the balance sheets and the geopolitical reality, it looks more like a country that is about to jump off a cliff without checking if there is water below. It is the classic conflict between the righteousness shield and the hard reality of global interdependence.
It really does feel like a high-stakes gamble where the person at the table does not realize they are betting their house. We want to spend today digging into why this happened, the technical realities of why this bill is actually a massive economic cell phone, and how the shifting political winds in Washington are turning Ireland's principled stance into a potential catastrophe for their domestic economy. We are going to look at the Semiconductor Trap, the Huckabee Doctrine, and the neutrality myth.
And we should probably start with the immediate fallout. The closure of the embassy in Dublin in January 2025 was the climax of years of friction, but it was triggered specifically by the government's insistence on pushing this settlements bill through despite repeated warnings from their own legal experts and international partners. The Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs did not just pull their staff, they downgraded the entire relationship to a non-resident ambassador based elsewhere. That is a massive signal in the world of diplomacy. It says, "We no longer consider you a serious partner worth having a physical presence with. You are now in the same category as countries where we have no shared interests."
And for a country like Ireland, which prides itself on soft power and its seat at the table in international forums, that should have been a wake-up call. But instead, it felt like the government in Dublin, led by architects like Simon Harris, leaned into it. They framed it as a badge of honor, a sign that Ireland was the moral conscience of Europe. But as we are going to see, You cannot pay your bills with badges of honor, especially when your bills are being paid by the very companies that this legislation inadvertently targets.
That is the core of the semiconductor trap we need to talk about. But before we get into the weeds of the supply chain, we should probably frame the broader shift. Ireland used to be known for a very pragmatic kind of neutrality. It was a don't rock the boat approach that allowed them to attract massive foreign direct investment. Now, it feels like they have traded that pragmatism for what we often call the righteousness shield. We actually went deep on that concept back in episode 979, looking at the social context in Ireland and the rise of certain domestic pressures, but today we are looking at the hard economic and legal consequences.
Right, because the shield might protect you from domestic political criticism or win you points on social media, but it does not stop a trade penalty from the United States Treasury. So, Herman, let us get into the technical side of this. Why is this specific bill, the 2025 Settlements Bill, such a nightmare for the Irish economy? On the surface, it just says they will not import goods from the settlements. To a casual observer, that sounds like a limited scope, right? They think they're just banning some fruit or some wine.
That is the great misconception, and it is one the Irish government has been happy to let persist. People think we are talking about boxes of dates or bottles of wine from the West Bank. If that were all it was, it would be a symbolic gesture with minimal impact. But we live in a world of deeply integrated high-tech supply chains. Ireland is a global hub for two things, big tech and big pharma. And here is the kicker. 3 United States multinationals. Apple, Microsoft, and Eli Lilly account for nearly 50% of Ireland's entire corporate tax revenue. Think about that. Half of the money the Irish government uses to build roads, run hospitals, and pay teachers comes from just 3 American companies.
That is an incredible level of dependency. It is basically a three-legged stool where all the legs are manufactured in the United States. If one of those legs wobbles, the whole Irish state budget collapses.
And those companies do not exist in a vacuum. They rely on components, intellectual property, and research and development that is global. Israel happens to be a massive node in that network. Take semiconductors, for example. Israel is Ireland's second largest trading partner outside of the European Union and the United States. That is a fact that often gets lost in the political noise. Why is that? Because of companies like Intel and a host of specialized firms in Israel that produce the microassemblies and the silicon that go into the products Apple and Microsoft sell. Intel has a massive presence in Leixlip, Ireland, but that plant is part of a global copy, exactly, manufacturing process that involves their plants in Israel, like the ones in Kiryat Gat.
So, if I am Apple, and I have my European headquarters in Cork Island, I am bringing in components from all over the world to facilitate my operations. If Ireland passes a law that criminalizes the importation of goods from certain regions, and those regions are integrated into the broader Israeli tech ecosystem, what happens to my supply chain?
You hit the semiconductor trap. Modern manufacturing does not work by saying this specific transistor was made in this specific town and stayed there. Components are often moved back and forth across lines for testing, assembly, and integration. If the Irish law is written broadly enough, which the 2025 bill is, it creates a massive legal gray area. A company like Microsoft or Intel cannot risk a criminal prosecution in Ireland for importing a component that might have a subassembly touched by a firm located across the Green Line or a company that provides logistics services in those areas. The legal risk alone makes Ireland a radioactive jurisdiction for high-tech manufacturing.
And it is not just the companies being cautious. The Irish Attorney General actually warned the government that this bill likely violates European Union single market trade law. In the European Union, trade policy is a competence of the Union, not individual member states. One country cannot just decide to ban imports from a trade partner that the rest of the European Union still recognizes. So Ireland is effectively picking a fight with Jerusalem, Washington, and Brussels all at the same time. It is a trifecta of diplomatic friction.
It is a bold strategy, but not a smart one. And the irony is that while they are doing this, they are ignoring the massive dependencies they have. We talked about this a bit in episode 474 when we discussed whether a nation can truly go it alone in the modern age. The answer for a small, open economy like Ireland is a resounding no. You cannot be a tax haven for American multinationals on Tuesday and then criminalize their supply chains on Wednesday. The companies will simply look at the map and realize that the Netherlands, or Luxembourg, or even Poland offer similar benefits without the legal landmines.
And let us talk about the reaction from the United States, because this is where the sober-up warning comes in. We have seen a massive shift in Washington's tone over the last year. It is no longer just polite diplomatic concern or a quiet memo from the State Department. We have seen figures like Mike Huckabee, the United States ambassador to Israel, being incredibly blunt about this. The message is, if you boycott our allies, do not expect your special economic relationship with us to remain untouched. This is what people are calling the Huckabee Doctrine.
It is a complete sea change. For decades, Ireland relied on the green jersey in Washington, the idea that because of the massive Irish-American diaspora and the sentimental ties of various presidents, Ireland was untouchable. But that political capital is drying up, especially among Republicans who see Ireland's stance as not just anti-Israel, but actively hostile to American strategic interests in the Middle East. There has been serious talk in Congress about designating Ireland as a country that boycotts Israel.
For our listeners who might not know, what does that designation actually mean in practice? It sounds like a diplomatic slap on the wrist, but I suspect it is much heavier than that.
It is a sledgehammer, corn. If the United States Treasury or Department of Commerce formally designates a jurisdiction as participating in a boycott of Israel, it triggers a host of automatic penalties under the Anti-Boycott Act. This can include the loss of tax credits for United States companies operating there, restrictions on technology transfers, and even direct fines. Imagine you are the chief financial officer of Apple or Eli Lilly. You are looking at Ireland, and suddenly the tax benefits of being there are being wiped out by United States federal penalties because the Irish government decided to pass a settlements bill. What do? You move. You do not wait for the Irish government to fix it. You move to a jurisdiction that does not create these headaches.
This is what I find so baffling. The Irish government knows these numbers. They know that 50% of their corporate tax comes from those three firms. They know that Intel has invested tens of billions of dollars in their Leixlip plant. And yet, they seem to prioritize a domestic political narrative over the very foundation of their national prosperity. Is this just a case of the righteousness shield being so thick that they cannot see the data? Or is there something else at play?
I think it is a combination of things. There is a historical narrative in Ireland that views the Palestinian struggle through the lens of Ireland's own history with British colonialism. It is a powerful emotive comparison even if it ignores the vast complexities and differences of the Middle East. But more than that, it has become a form of virtue signaling that is incredibly cheap for the politicians in the short term. It gets them cheers in Dublin. It plays well on the evening news, and they figure the Americans will never actually pull the plug because of the St. Patrick's Day factor.
But that is a dangerous assumption to make in 2026. The political alignment in the United States has shifted. There is much less patience for allies who want all the benefits of the American security and economic umbrella while actively undermining American policy. And that brings us to the Selective Outrage Index. This is something that really highlights the inconsistency of the Irish position. If you are going to be the moral arbiter of the world, you have to be consistent.
This is where the hypocrisy becomes impossible to ignore. If Ireland's stance was based on a universal, consistent principle regarding occupied territories or human rights, you would see similar legislation targeting, say, Morocco for its occupation of Western Sahara, or Turkey for Northern Cyprus, or certainly China for its actions in Tibet or Xinjiang. But there are no bills in the Oireachtas to ban goods from those regions. In fact, Ireland is very keen to expand trade with China. They are actively courting Chinese investment while simultaneously trying to dismantle their trade relationship with Israel.
It is a glaring double standard. When you look at the trade volume, Ireland has no problem engaging with regimes that have objectively worse human rights records than Israel. But Israel gets this singular, intense focus. It is the only country that Ireland is willing to risk its entire economic model to punish. When you point this out to proponents of the bill, the response is usually some variation of, well, we have to start somewhere, but they never seem to start anywhere else. It feels less like a principled foreign policy and more like a targeted obsession.
And that is why the term myopic obsession is so accurate. It is not a broad foreign policy framework, it is a laser-focused hostility toward one specific state. And that leads to a very uncomfortable question about what is driving that focus. We have seen reports of a massive spike in anti-Semitic incidents in Ireland over the last couple of years. We covered that March 2026 report in episode 1020. When you have institutional hostility at the government level, it creates a permission structure for that kind of behavior in society. It normalizes the idea that one specific group or state is the source of all global ill.
It is a feedback loop. The government uses the rhetoric to appeal to the public, and the public energy then pushes the government to take even more extreme legislative steps. But while this is happening, Ireland is also ignoring its own physical security. This is what we call the neutrality myth. Ireland prides itself on being militarily neutral, but that neutrality is a complete fiction in the modern world. It is a luxury they can only afford because of their geography and their neighbors.
It is a thin veneer at best. Ireland has almost no primary radar, a tiny navy, and an air force that consists of a few propeller planes. How do they protect their airspace? They have a secret agreement with the United Kingdom's Royal Air Force to intercept threats. How do they protect the subsea cables that carry all that big tech data between America and Europe? Those cables are the literal nervous system of the Irish economy. They rely on NATO and the Royal Navy to patrol those waters.
So, let me get this straight. Ireland is antagonizing the United States and Israel, two of the world's leaders in security and intelligence technology, while simultaneously relying on the United Kingdom and NATO for its basic survival. It is like being the person in the house who refuses to pay for the security system, but expects the neighbors to run over with a shotgun if someone breaks in. And then, to make it worse, you spend all day yelling at the neighbors for how they handle their own business.
And that is an untenable position. In a world where global tensions are rising, the idea of a free rider who is also a moral scold is becoming less and less acceptable to the people who are actually providing the security. If Ireland continues down this path of becoming a diplomatic pariah in the West, why should the Royal Air Force continue to spend their taxpayers' money patrolling Irish skies? Why should the United States continue to share intelligence on threats to those data centers in Dublin? Security is a two-way street, and Ireland is currently driving the wrong way.
It feels like a slow-motion car crash. You can see the impact coming, but the driver is busy checking their social media mentions to see how many people liked their latest speech at the United Nations. And the economic consequences are not just theoretical anymore. We are starting to see the first signs of capital flight. It is not a mass exodus yet, but the smart money is already looking for the exits.
We are. We have seen several mid-sized venture capital firms that focus on the tech transfer between Israel and Europe move their headquarters out of Dublin over the last 6 months. They are citing regulatory uncertainty. That is, code for, we do not know if our business will be illegal next month. And once the big players, the Apples and the Microsofts, start to shift their future investments elsewhere, it is very hard to get them back. Ireland's success was built on being the most stable, predictable place for capital. They are throwing that predictability into the trash for a short-term political high.
So, if you are a listener looking at this from a pragmatic perspective, what are the takeaways? First, I think it is the danger of letting domestic virtue signaling dictate international trade policy. In a globalized economy, you cannot decouple your moral stances from your supply chains. If you want to be a hub for global tech, you have to accept that tech is a global, integrated business. You cannot pick and choose which parts of the motherboard you are okay with based on a map of the West Bank.
And the second takeaway is that neutrality is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. You cannot be neutral on security but aggressive on trade and expect everyone to just keep supporting you. Ireland is discovering that the green jersey has its limits. When you bite the hand that feeds you, and in this case the hand is the United States and the tech sector, you should not be surprised when the food stops coming. The Huckabee Doctrine is a warning that the era of sentimental diplomacy is over.
It is also a lesson in the importance of consistency. If you are going to claim the moral high ground, you have to apply your standards universally. the selective outrage toward Israel, while ignoring the actions of major trade partners like China or Turkey, destroys your credibility on the international stage. It makes it clear that your policy is not about human rights. It is about political convenience and historical grievances that are being misapplied to a modern conflict. It makes you look like an unreliable partner.
And we have to talk about the path forward. Is there a way back? Is rapprochement even possible at this point? When you have closed an embassy and passed legislation that criminalizes your partner's trade, you have crossed a Rubicon. The bilateral relationship with Jerusalem is effectively poisoned. Even if a new government comes into power in Dublin tomorrow, the trust is gone, and more importantly, the trust in Washington is severely damaged. They have seen that Ireland is willing to prioritize a specific ideological stance over the stability of American-led trade networks.
It is much harder to build a reputation than it is to destroy one. Ireland spent 40 years building its reputation as a pragmatic, reliable economic partner. It has taken less than 5 years to put that entire legacy at risk. The question now is whether the Irish public will realize the cost of this righteousness shield before the economic damage becomes permanent. When the corporate tax receipts start to dip, it will be too late to say, "We were just kidding about the bill."
It is a tough spot to be in. When the budget surpluses turn into deficits and the government has to explain why they are cutting services while they still have a moral victory on the shelf, that is when the reality will set in. But by then, the companies might already be gone. The thing about multinationals is that they are mobile. They do not have a home in the way a citizen does. They go where it is safe, predictable, and profitable. Ireland is making itself none of those things.
I think we should also look at the broader European Union context. Ireland is trying to be the first to break the trade consensus. They want to be the vanguard of this movement. But being the vanguard often means you are the one who takes all the arrows. If the European Court of Justice strikes down this bill, which many legal experts expect them to do because it infringes on the EU's exclusive competence over trade, Ireland will have gone through all this diplomatic pain and economic risk for a law that cannot even be enforced.
It would be the ultimate embarrassment. You destroy your relationship with your most important allies, you trigger warnings from the United States Treasury, you see capital flight starting, all for a piece of legislation that is essentially a legal fantasy. It shows a lack of basic statecraft. You do not pass laws that you know are likely illegal under the treaties you have signed, especially when the cost of doing so is your national prosperity. It is amateur hour on a global stage.
It really highlights the gap between the political class in Dublin and the technical reality of how the world works. It is easy to give a speech in the Dáil about standing up for justice. It is much harder to explain to a worker at an Intel plant in Kildare why their job is being moved to Germany or Ohio because the government decided to pick a fight over semiconductor components. The disconnect is profound.
And that is the tragedy of it. The people who will suffer the most from these decisions are not the politicians who make them. They will still have their pensions and their international speaking tours. It is the ordinary Irish citizens who have benefited from 30 years of unprecedented growth. They are the ones who will deal with the fallout of capital flight, the loss of the United States security umbrella, and the potential for a long-term economic stagnation.
We have covered a lot of ground today, from the technicalities of the Semiconductor Trap to the shifting sands of Washington politics and the Huckabee Doctrine. It is a complex, sobering situation. If you are interested in the historical context of the Jewish community in Ireland and why these diplomatic shifts are so significant, definitely check out episode 972, The Last Minion. It really puts the current decline into perspective and shows how the social fabric is changing alongside the diplomacy.
And if you want to see how the broader pro-Israel consensus is changing, or not, in the United States, episode 981 on the opinion gap is a great companion to this discussion. It helps explain why the reaction from Washington has been so surprisingly sharp for the folks in Dublin. They thought they were playing to an American audience that no longer exists in the same way.
Well, Herman, I think we have laid out the case. Ireland is at a crossroads. They can either return to the pragmatic statecraft that made them a global success story, or they can continue to hide behind the righteousness shield until the economic reality finally breaks through. It is not a choice I would want to have to make, but it is the one they have chosen for themselves.
Precisely. It is a lesson for every small nation in a globalized world. Your principles have to be grounded in reality, or they will eventually ground you. You cannot eat your principles when the factories close.
On that note, we are going to wrap things up for today. This has been a deep dive, and we hope it gave you some clarity on a situation that is often buried in slogans and rhetoric. If you are enjoying these deep dives into the weird and complex prompts Daniel sends our way, please take a second to leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. It really does help other people find the show and keeps us going.
It really does. And if you want to stay up to date with all our episodes, head over to myweirdprompts.com. You can find our RSS feed there, or you can search for My Weird Prompts on Telegram to get a notification every time we drop a new one. We are also on Spotify, so make sure to follow us there as well.
Thanks for joining us today. We will be back soon with another deep dive into the prompts that keep us thinking. Until next time, I am Corn.
And I am Herman Poppleberry. Thanks for listening to My Weird Prompts. Keep asking the hard questions.
Take care, everyone.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the flows from sloth.